Господин представитель, это что, для вас открытие? Весь мир знает, что самая империалистическая держава – это Соединенные Штаты Америки.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
The Soviets and Americans had very different ideas on what to do with what remained of the modern world. The Soviets wanted to barricade themselves in by puppeting their surrounding countries, and even countries they didn't share a border with, in an attempt to secure themselves from the Americans. America, in love with the idea of self-determination and democracy, would not stand for this. The general populace of both countries were very much aware of the capabilities of an atom bomb. It would not be untrue to say that there was a certain amount of panic throughout the entirety of the war. Now, the US and Soviet Union were not so kind as to host the war on their own territory, and instead turned turbulent countries such as Vietnam into their war zones. This was met with a lot of protest and was the subject of much controversy. The two superpowers did not differ in just ideology. During the Cold War, their respective art styles were in almost direct opposition to each other. American painters such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko were focused on abstract expressionism. Vibrant colors and bold strokes made up the American style deemed the weapon of the Cold War. Soviet art was much more censored, as only artwork portraying the USSR as unified, strong, and proud was allowed to circulate. Many times during the Cold War, there were confrontations between the two superpowers that were not far from causing nuclear retaliation. In 1948, USSR troops blocked off West Berlin, stopping the flow of goods and threatening to starve millions of Germans. Rather than attack, the US-led allies opted to fly in supplies in a life-saving series of deliveries known as the Berlin Airlift. The most tense the relations between the USSR and USA ever got was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, planned to place medium-range ICBMs on the communist island of Cuba. Not long before, the US had actually attempted to invade Cuba, yet was thwarted by a combined Cuban-Soviet defense, and the US settled for a loss. As the USSR attempted to move missiles to Cuba, the US blockaded the ships and they sat there for days. Eventually, the dispute was resolved through diplomacy and missiles returned to Russia.
The Cold War did not just push boundaries between these two nations, but increased scientific and technological funding led to many of the technologies we enjoy today. But most importantly, they pushed man to the moon. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first ever satellite, Sputnik, and in 1961 sent Yuri Gagarin into space. The US needed to catch up, so in 1969 they put astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins on the moon. As mentioned earlier, the Vietnam War was another one of the most important and most heated aspects of the Cold War. Divided between a communist North and an anti-communist South, Vietnam was the embodiment of the Cold War, with the only distinction between friend and foe being political dogma. Led by Ho Chi Minh, the north of Vietnam was backed by nearly the entirety of the communist world. The anti-communists could not break through their lines. Exacerbating tensions, a group of rebels in the south, known as the Viet Cong, constantly berated American troops through the use of guerrilla warfare and their advantageous home terrain. Eventually, the war protests grew to such a degree and the attrition suffered by the American military was such that they withdrew from the war and allowed the country to unite under communist leadership.
Economic strength was key. The US funneled billions into rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, hoping prosperity would keep countries from falling to communism. The Soviet Union poured massive resources into its military, but struggled to keep its economy healthy. Meanwhile, Western economies faced challenges like stagflation, a weird situation where prices rose but growth stalled. This put the world into trading blocs, with economic alliances reflecting political ones. Religion was another front. The Soviet Union cracked down on churches and religious leaders, pushing atheism to keep control. The Orthodox Church was especially targeted. In contrast, the US linked Christianity with freedom, using faith as a way to highlight the difference between the free world and the godless communists. religion wasn't just personal, it became political. This era was also shaped by powerful personalities. Harry Truman, who set the tone for resisting communism. John F. Kennedy, who faced down the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dwight Eisenhower, who warned about the growing power of the military-industrial complex. Ronald Reagan, who was known for his strict, hardline anti-communist reforms. He focused on militarization, intense anti-communist campaigns, and pushed hard against the Soviet Union before working with Mikhail Gorbachev, whose reforms led to the Cold War's peaceful end. Earlier, there was Joseph Stalin, whose brutal rule set the precedent of the USSR being a heavily censored, merciless dictatorship. Yet Nikita Khrushchev challenged the West with bold moves and reforms of de-Stalinization. The Soviet Union met its economic collapse under the rule of Gorbachev, who attempted to loosen the iron grip of the USSR with policies of glasnost and perestroika.
The Cold War came to an end in 1991, yet its reverberations can still be felt within our modern world. This ideological battle between two worldly superpowers shaped alliances and rivalries that define global politics today. It pushed forward work towards modern technologies such as satellites, GPS, and the internet, which were all born from this competition.
Understanding the Cold War helps us see why the world is the way it is now, and reminds us the dangers of global conflict. The Cold War was a complex story of fear, power, and ideas. It wasn't just about bombs or spies. It was about how two conflicting socio-political visions fought for the future. This struggle for power, which caused anxiety throughout humanity, has shaped our world, creating new technology, beliefs, and political landscapes.